So, this is the third week of our Prism series, and this is where we invite leaders and participants in other faith-based systems to come and share their experiences. So our first week we had a Buddhist nun, last week we had a Muslim imam, and this week we'll be hearing from a New Thought Science of Mind minister. So I know I'm not alone when I say this has been incredible and unlike anything I've ever experienced in church. I'm guessing it's the way for most of us. I don't know a better way of connecting with people than through personal stories. And sometimes those are my own stories, and sometimes I'm telling other stories from other people, usually with their permission. And I think for so many of us, our spiritual formation comes from our background. So a lot of you know that my first experiences with God and my perceptions of spirituality were really of a personal and benevolent God. This was a God filled with love and unerringly inclusive and personified by the really gentle grace of Jesus. And you may also have heard me say that I was raised in this environment of intellectual, free-thinking, and that really formed my perception of who God is. My perception was that there was truly, like it says in Romans 8:1, no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. And my understanding, which could be perceived as extremely naive, was that no one was outside of Jesus, so there was no condemnation at all. In fact, when I would hear that God disapproved of things, and this was as a kid in like the early 70s, late 60s, that God disapproved of gay marriage or women in leadership or birth control, I knew in my heart that that was ridiculous. That was not the God that I knew. But then, like so many of us, I fell into a more mainstream Christianity, and it seemed like there was condemnation for everyone. Everyone was in danger of the condemnation that came from the really effective manipulation, and I want to say that again, the effective manipulation of verses like Jeremiah 17:9, which says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure." So is anybody resonating with this? Anyway, at this point, I was beginning to be always concerned that my skepticism was the result of my wicked and deceitful heart. And even though, like I said, I had that feeling that the way I perceived things was right, there was always that fear because my heart was probably deceiving me, that my ability to teach and to lead even men gasp, which, you know, in Western Christianity, that is not supposed to happen, and to serve in leadership, that was really my own ego trip, and that was the devil trying to gain a foothold. And maybe some of the sexual attraction I felt was ordained by God, but maybe some of it was depraved. And maybe it really was God's will that babies be born into addiction or abuse instead of preventing that suffering on the front end. And then, like, cue the opening of the heavens and the angel choirs, God began to funnel people into my life that had that Micah 6:8 mentality. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. It says, He has shown you, O God, or shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So this all came full circle when I entered seminary and was taking classes, am taking classes right now, that actually give theological credence to different expressions of faith. So our guest, Jerry Troyer, who you heard from earlier, is a ministry leader in science of mind and New Thought. And this is also known as religious science. And he directed me to a website for the Centers for Spiritual Living, and that's csl.org. And I want to tell you, this was not, so every week, Brandon, before we started our interview, has given an overview of the faith systems that we're talking about. this was not as easy to define as Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism, because there is such freedom of expression and representation in New Thought theology. So I'm just going to give you a few facts that I got both from materials that I discussed with Jerry and from the csl.org site. So it was founded by Dr. Ernest Holmes, who was born in 1887 on a farm in Maine, and he spent his teenage years asking himself questions like, what is God? Who am I? Why am I here? And we all ask ourselves those questions, but I found it really fascinating that he spent so much time outdoors. And I think that we end up with a more expansive view of God when we are surrounded by nature and by creation, instead of focusing on humans and our, sometimes our shortcomings. The Centers for Spiritual Living is now a global community made up of more than 400 spiritual communities, teaching chapters, study groups, and ministries in 30 countries. New Thought philosophy brings religion and science together and prioritizes the transformation of personal lives and helping make the world a better place. They hold that all life is sacred and that each human being is an expression of God. The karmic principle of cause and effect is integral to science of mind, teaching that it is done to you as you believe. A core belief is that expectations create our reality, and teachings incorporate wisdom from centuries of various spiritual traditions. People of all spiritual paths, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, all are welcome into New Thought communities. And the objective is to help people experience a personal relationship with the Creator, to promote a community of tolerance, understanding, and respect, to provide classes, programs, prayer, meditation, and to advocate a safe spiritual community of like-minded people interested in living a spiritual life. A lot of that sounds like what we do here also. So as we've been doing, I want to provide the names of a couple of books that will give you greater insight to science of mind. So the first is A Course in Miracles, and this is by Helen Schuckman. And the next is Coming Out to Ourselves, and this is by Jerry. So I read this book a couple of years back when Jerry came and spoke to us. And it was an amazing testimony, but when you don't know the people that you're reading about, it kind of melds into all the other testimonies that you've read. When I went back, after talking to Jerry, we got together last week and had coffee, and went back and read this again. This is such an incredible, transparent testimony of the moving of God and your participation in that. So with that, I want to welcome Jerry up here. He's from the Ohm Center for Spiritual Living. So I want to first, and feel free to get settled, this is, when they first said we were going to do this, I pictured like, I pictured wing chairs on the stage. This is not, but stools are okay.
Absolutely.
So I want to get basic doctrinal questions out of the way, and then as far as you're comfortable, get into your own faith journey. So first up front, what did I get right and what might need to be corrected? And can New Thought and science of mind be used interchangeably?
Yes, and yes.
Okay.
And let me start by saying when a lot of times when people hear science, they think of Scientology. That's not what this is. That is not what this is. The Centers for Spiritual Living is the big umbrella organization for religious science and New Thought churches, and a lot of their work is based on the writings of Ernest Holmes, which you mentioned, but absolutely everything I say on Sunday morning, we can pull out of the words of Jesus in the New Testament. Absolutely everything. So we call it New Thought. It's not really a new thought, but it's a new thought in that we're going back and saying, now what was it that he said? It's done unto you as you believe. Greater than these things will you do? You know, those most amazing prosperity promises of Jesus in the New Testament that we somehow just kind of glaze over.
So what
So,
does...
and one more thing, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So the New Thought umbrella, if you will, is religious science and science of mind. It's also unity, divine science, and Christian science. So different faith-based traditions under this New Thought umbrella, because again, we're looking at the Bible and reading it again and seeing those amazing promises that Jesus gives us.
So is there a relevance to the word science, and how does the karmic principle tie into New Thought?
The word science is important because if you're a scientist and you're doing experiments, if you do it the same way, it works the same way all the time. We believe when we use affirmative prayer. So we're not begging, beseeching, pleading God to do something. We are accepting that God is going to do that for us. And I would say God being Spirit, the universe, the infinite, the divine, our higher power, whatever we choose to call it. Because Jesus said, again, it's done unto you as you believe. So as I believe that this is going to happen for me, I'm not talking God into anything. I'm accepting whatever it is.
Okay, and yes.
And so the karmic part is cause and effect. So if I am sharing love in the community, if I am forgiving as I need to myself and others, if I am recognizing that God is my source, as I'm living this life, my life has to start changing for the better. If I am out to get whatever I can from somebody else, if I'm just rotten out there in the world, using a purely spiritual term, then that's my life at some level, my life is going to reflect that, because it has to. You know, we don't plant roses and harvest garlic and vice versa. What we plant, we harvest.
So some of these questions, as we move forward, disclaimer, might sound offensive, but these are actually from the CSL FAQ page. So I want you to know that I'm asking questions that I'm guessing other people have asked also. Do people who practice science of mind go to doctors?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's the difference between us and Christian Science. If you're familiar with Christian Science, you know that they do not believe in doctors. They are completely on that the mind can heal you, that God will heal you, and if you're not healed for some reason, it's your time to move on to your next experience, whatever you believe that to be. We believe that our doctors are incredibly wise, and if you need to go to the doctor, go to the doctor.
Are you a New Age organization?
A lot of people hear what we talk about and think of it as really very airy-fairy. Again, using a purely spiritual term. You know, the New Age with the crystals and the tarot cards, and there are people in the teaching that use those, and that's absolutely fine. But I love my Bible. I love my Bible, and I love the words of Jesus, and so I would say no. New Thought, not New Age.
Okay. Is Centers for Spiritual Living a cult?
Absolutely not.
Let's define what a cult is, because I think that's the reason I brought that question up. I think so many times we're willing to define things that we don't understand or that we don't resonate with as cultish.
Yeah.
And what happens here is entirely voluntary participation. There's nothing compulsory about this.
Right.
These are people who are really looking to come together and better life for themselves, but even more than that, for those around them.
Absolutely. So if you come to my church on Sunday morning and you ask me for the key, I'll let you out the door. No, I'm kidding. Just making sure you're paying attention. That's not what this is. And again, we base this teaching on the words of Jesus. So there's no cult involved here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to combine the next two questions, and you can take this in whatever direction you want. So I wanted to ask, are there other common misperceptions about your faith? And what are the roles of Jesus and the Bible and prayer in your faith?
I think the main thing, again, as I mentioned earlier, is hearing the word science and thinking that we're Scientology, and that's not who we are. That's not the truth. A misperception that somehow some guy came up with this, standing out in a farmland someplace and pulled this out of his hat, and this became a teaching. But that's not what's going on here, because again, we can trace the foundations of what we believe back to the Bible. So we look at Jesus as the great example, not the great exception. Because he said, greater than these things will you do. It's the most, if you have the opportunity, go back in the Gospels, in the first 4 books of the New Testament, and read some of those amazing promises. There are 7 or 8 examples of people being healed. And in every one of those examples, he said, your faith has made you whole. Not my faith, not because you've been good, not because you go to church. Your faith has made you whole. So we do a lot of work on ourselves. Because once I say that prayer, what do I believe about that? Do I deserve whatever it is I'm asking for? Or do I still have guilt and shame about the divorce I went through, or my sexual orientation, or something that happened when I was 7 years old? Or do I really believe those promises that God is going to do what Jesus said God would do for me? Prayer, we use affirmative prayer because Jesus wrote, pray believing you have received and you will receive. So we know when we do our prayer work that it has to happen for us based on those teachings of Jesus. But we do a lot of work in questioning, what do I really believe about this? And who is God? Is God the hateful, surly, cranky, white, straight old man up on a cloud someplace that either says yes or no depending on the mood he's in? Or is he the loving, nurturing presence that Jesus describes in the New Testament? That's a big question for us, because whatever it is, the new relationship, the greater financial abundance, the better health, whatever it is, isn't going to happen for us if we don't believe it's going to.
What is the view of baptism and communion? And does your specific community engage in those practices, and does the larger community?
Mine does not. Some do and some don't. It just depends on the church or the center and what their practices are.
Okay. So in what we discussed, and you've touched on this a little bit, but I really got the impression that healing is a central part of New Thought, Science of Mind philosophy. And I wanted to know your thoughts on that. Can you speak to that?
Healing is huge for us, and it's physical, emotional, and spiritual, because in that we come to this moment at 10:30 or so on Sunday morning with our stories and our stuff. And sometimes it's wonderful and loving and nurturing. Wendy talked a little about hers, and mine was growing up in a Missouri Synod Lutheran church. And if you're familiar with the Lutheran Church, you know that they have synods or groups, and the different groups have different levels of what's a good word to use? Different levels of guilt. We were really close to Catholic without the fun, so we got all the guilt, all the shame, all the nonsense without the incense and the high church. And so So imagine my experience of, and I think I'll talk more about this later, but imagine my experience of coming out as a gay man, listening to what the church told me that, you're going to hell, Missy. There's nothing that can be done. So we look at this healing has to do a lot with our beliefs and our feelings, a lot with our stories, and a lot with our relationships with God, with other people, with money, with our physical bodies, all of that.
Okay. So this is going to sound broad, but I think these elements tie together. What's your view on suffering, spiritual warfare, and God's will?
We believe that God's will for us is our will for us when we are living from our hearts, when we are serving others, when we come from a place of non-judgment, recognizing that each person is the beloved. That is God's will for us, but we also have free will. So I can get and stay clean and sober. I can look for a relationship that really serves me, or I can stay stuck in that old stuff, but it's our choice on how we want to live our lives. And so, not always, certainly, but sometimes our suffering is self-induced because we're carrying those old beliefs and those old ideas, and that somehow we're going to get a better seat in heaven if we go through this experience. But Jesus said it's the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom, and I suggest that the kingdom is not only in the sweet by and by, it's also in this moment. It's the Father's good pleasure that we be happy and healthy and abundant and live wonderful, giving, sharing, fulfilling lives. That's what we're here to do. It doesn't praise God if we're living 80 or 90 years in misery.
So probably the most difficult question for any faith, then how do you reconcile people who are suffering and doing all the right things and that the suffering is no fault of their own?
I believe we came here into this life, into this experience, with something to do. We hear about babies who are born and have a terrible disease and live a small period of time and then they die. We see on the television the terrible, heart-wrenching accidents and wars and all of these things that just break our hearts when we see what people are going through. And what I believe is that we're not all supposed to be here for those 80 or 90 years. And so often when you see these stories, you hear the families saying, this experience was so awful and yet it brought us together. So what I know is there's always something more. The Bible says, do not judge by appearances, but judge by right action. And so when we allow ourselves to see, yes, this is the appearance of this terrible thing, but is there something more? Is there a blessing here? Is there an opportunity for healing here? So we look at that.
Okay. So this is I'm gonna put these two questions together also because you touched on both of these. What's the new thought perspective of guilt and shame? And can you now share some of more of your early faith experience, how you ended up a Science of Mind minister, and what that's been like in your trajectory as an adult?
Mm-hmm. The new thought perspective of guilt and shame is the only thing it accomplishes is it keeps us stuck in living a life that we really didn't want to live. Because who told you? Who told you that was wrong? Who told you that it's bad to be LGBTQ? Who told you it was bad to get a divorce? Who told you that, and what rule did you follow? Whose rule was that you took as your own and are basing that guilt and shame off of that rule? I talk about this is not a commercial, I promise, but I talk a lot about that in my book, and the rules that we have based on what our parents, our grandparents taught us, or what society tells us, or what we hear on the news, and so we carry that guilt and shame about what happened. And what we know is every moment is a new, fresh opportunity to step into that greater life. And we're invited to do that. We're challenged to do that, but we got to let go of those ideas and that guilt and shame that no longer serves us.
So you've really experienced some redemption in your own relationships. And as much as you're comfortable talking about that, you talked about your parenting relationships and your marriage and just some incredible things going on there. Are you comfortable sharing some of that?
Sure.
And just so you know, I'm going to do the commercial. His book, I hope, is going to be over there, and you can talk to Jerry after the service. And it's really a story worth reading.
Thank you for that. Well, so growing up, and I talked about this a little bit before. So growing up in the church, without any kind of opening for possibility. We were not encouraged to bring our Bible to church on Sunday, and we were not encouraged to ask questions. So it just was what it was. And even though my parents were very loving and very nurturing and very welcoming and accepting, my church was not. And so for whatever reason, I got the idea from the church that, you're going to have to resolve this. So I got to pray the gay away. Anybody ever done that? All that nonsense. And so I did that for years and years and years, and dang it just didn't go away. But I kept working at it. And then if I get married, I'll be okay. So I did, and I wasn't. But I was married to a woman for almost 3 years. We have a son together. I have grandchildren. I have no idea how that happened, but absolutely, my son and daughter-in-law and the grandkids live in Oregon. Absolutely awesome, very loving, a very loving group. But so did that. Determined this just doesn't work. I have to let this go. And so after about 3 years of being together, we got a divorce, and I went on with my life. But so often we carry these rules with us about what we have to do and what we can't do. If something happened in your life, you can know if you've forgiven it and you're over it if you can talk about it without getting emotional. Apparently, I got more work to do on this. My husband and I have been together, it'll be 33 years in September. And thank you. And about 11 years ago, he had been working for a major San Diego healthcare provider. And he was doing fantastically. He was making six figures. He drove a BMW. I was working for a major technology market research company. I drove a BMW. We had his and his BMWs. Life was just wonderful. And then I like to say lovingly released, but I got laid off. So all of a sudden, I had been traveling a lot for business. I went at least 1 week a year to the East Coast to meet with clients. But I got laid off, and so then was home every day. And so what I found was that he had been missing work that I didn't know about. And so this is the beginning of 2009, and figuring out what's going on, and he's missing work. And so he had responsibility for multiple clinics with this major healthcare provider and was doing fantastically, and they loved him, and he hated every minute of it. Ever been in a job where you make a lot of money and everybody loves you and you just dread going to work on Monday morning. Anybody ever been in that situation? Yeah. So one Friday night, he's at work and I'm waiting at home, and he calls me and says, I'm going to be late. I got some stuff to do. I'll be late. I'll call you when I'm done. I'll stop and get dinner and then come home. And I'm like, fine. And so then the next time I saw him was Tuesday afternoon. Oh my God, what happened to you? Are you okay? I'm fine. It's just been so stressful. I just needed a weekend away. I'll be okay. It won't happen again. Except it did. And then it did. And then it did. And so about every 2 to 3 weeks, he would be gone for the weekend. And this went on for almost a year. And I believed him when he said, I've just been under so much stress and I just need time away and I'm so sorry and it won't happen again. And I have no idea what's going on here. I had absolutely no clue, because nobody I know is a drug addict. So we finally got to the point of him telling me what was going on, and he'd been using crystal meth. His rule was, you can't step down from this senior management job. You can't say, I can't do this. You can't disappoint people by saying, no, I don't want to do this. So you have to find a way to make it work. And the only way he could think of was by using. So this was March of 2010, and he finally said, I just can't do this anymore. And so, because several people at his work that I was close friends with too called me and said, I don't know what's going on with him, but he's either asleep in a meeting or he's so wound up we don't know what's going on. There's something going on here. Have you thought that it might be drugs? I'm like, there is no way. There is no way. But it was. So, to make a long story even longer, he quit the job, just making sure you're paying attention, quit the job, went through 6 months of outpatient at Stepping Stone, which is an amazing program, and has totally rebuilt his life. And he's now an assistant director at UCSD. So I think this New Thought teaching encourages and even challenges us to spend more time in our minds and in our hearts. What's going on here that I can't do this? What's going on here that I have these feelings of guilt and shame? What's this rule that I carry with me? And is it really true for me? And if it's true for me now, do I need to change the rule? Because sometimes we do. You know, if you're heterosexual or were in a heterosexual marriage and you march down the aisle till death do us part, and then you get a divorce, do you carry guilt and shame about that? That we absolutely could. So we got to look at what we believe, look at our rules, and decide what we can change.
Man, that is so true. So one of the things we talked about, and as we're wrapping it up, I want you to think about anything else that you want to share and how you would define the impact of science of mind on your life. But one of the verses you brought up when we were talking was from Philippians 4, and this sounds like easy faith, but living in a way that we are intentionally pursuing what God wants for us really can be a difficult thing. So I wanted to share this verse. This is Philippians 4:4-8. And it says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Does that tie into what you're talking about?
Absolutely. I did a Sunday talk. We call them talks. It's not a sermon because I'm not telling you what you have to believe. I'm sharing ideas with you, so we call them talks. I did a talk a couple of months ago about what's going on out there. And if you watch MSNBC like I do, there's the remote. There's the remote. It's calling your name. Change the channel to Golden Girls reruns, but I just can't. I just can't. And guess what? Guess what? Knowing about all that nonsense is doing for me absolutely nothing. But my talk was about. I took the San Diego Union and I found 5 things. Oh my goodness. There was a car collision. There was something goofy going on in Washington. What a surprise. There was something going on in local government that was goofy. What a surprise. There was something else going on that was less than positive. And then there was a guy that lost his leg in a sailing accident, getting ready to sail back to Hawaii. There were, and I don't remember the other examples, but the point is that in this moment of those things that we say that are, oh my goodness, there are also those most amazing blessings and overcomings and new lessons for us. And so where do we put our vision? Where do we put our attention? I love that, and I think I told you it was Thessalonians, but you're right, it was Philippians. I knew it ended with an ions. But focus on these things. Focus, because there's stuff. There's stuff. There is. Again, using a purely spiritual term. There's stuff going on out there, but we don't have to spend all of our time focusing on it. We can instead focus on the amazing things, on the amazing love that our higher power has for us, for the amazing prosperity lessons that Jesus gave us. We can focus on those things, and guess what? What you focus on expands. So as we focus on those things, as we're grateful for those things, as we forgive what needs to be forgiven, those things in our lives expand, and we have more things to be grateful for. That's how it works.
That's incredible. You have anything else you want to add or share?
Two really quick things. It's our story. I told you a piece of my story, and I got to tell you, I went through a long time really beating myself up over, how stupid could you be? If you had stepped in and helped him 3 months into it, 6 months into it, whatever, then you wouldn't have had to, and fill in the blanks. But you know what? We're always doing the best we can. And so is everybody else. So he had to go through what he went through so that he could heal his life. I had to go through what I went through. So when we look back and say, if I just would have, there's the most wonderful opportunity to forgive. I talk a lot about forgiveness of our parents, of our ex-spouses, of the guy that just cut me off in the left-bound lane, of the guy that's using his cell phone in the left-bound lane going 55 miles an hour when I'm late to work. And you get to fill in the blank. And forgiveness is just the most wonderful thing because it's like an onion. You just keep peeling off the layers, and there's always something else to forgive. And the other thing I would say is, think about what we think about. As I was writing the book, we had the opportunity to go to, and really quickly, we had the opportunity to go see a taping of the Dr. Phil show in Hollywood, which was very cool. If you watch it, it really is that hardwood. It really is that hardwood set with the blue lights and all that. It really is beautiful. But one of the groups that he was interviewing were 4 young women under the age of 18 that had been sexting. They'd been sending out, and this was a few years ago, I don't even know if we still use that term or not, but sending less than appropriate messages out to potential boyfriends and pictures and so on and so on. And the parents, of course, obviously were very upset because these girls were 15 and 16 years old and a little young for this. So Dr. Phil interviewed them and he said, "Why are you doing this?" And they said, "We're just looking for somebody to love us." And in each conversation, and he didn't pick up on it, and I wanted to raise my hand and say, "Yo, Phil, you're missing out on something here," which I, of course, did not do. Each of the girls had been adopted. So very possibly, and I don't know this for a fact, but very possibly maybe they believed that their parents didn't love them and just threw them away. And so they were looking for somebody to love them. But what if they changed their story to be, not only did my birth parents love me so much, recognize that they couldn't take care of me the way they should have, so they gave me a family that could. So not only was I loved by my birth parents, I was loved by my adoptive parents. Mm-hmm. It's our story, and it sticks to us. It sticks to us because the choices we make are based on our story and what we believe about ourselves. And so it's up to us to see, this doesn't make sense for me anymore. Because we have this most amazing wisdom within us. That's God. That's Jesus. That's Spirit. That's the wisdom of the universe within us that can help us be reminded of the truth of who we are. Okay, I'm done.
Oh, man. That is awesome. I want to remind you that Jerry will be over in Sacred Grounds after the service to talk with you and sign books and stuff. I also want to say, as you were talking about those girls and their experience, I think so often we make bad choices and get caught up in things because we think that God doesn't love us and has thrown us away. And when we turn that story around to the type of redemption that you've been talking about, it changes everything, not just for us, but it radiates out. Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
We're going to move into communion.